Good morning. So, as Alyssa mentioned, my name is Colby Synesael, and I do work at COWEN, which is an investment bank. And as she mentioned, I've been there since 2010, but I've been covering the telecom services sector since 2003. So just to give you a quick background on what a sell-side or an equity research analyst does, because I'm going to guess some of you in the room don't know that. What I do is I basically put buy, sell, and hold ratings on certain stocks that are public. So I cover the wireless companies, I cover the tower companies, I cover the fiber companies like a Level 3 or Zayo, and I cover the data center companies like an Equinix or Digital Realty Trust. Our primary clients are buy-side funds, so hedge funds and mutual funds. And ultimately, my firm gets paid by me giving advice. And if they like that advice, hopefully they'll trade through our firm. They'll give us 2 or 3 cents a share. And if you think about that in terms of trading every million shares, that's $20,000 or $30,000. That's how I primarily get paid, and that's primarily what my firm does. But obviously, we go pretty deep into the sectors that we cover, and the sector that I cover, as I mentioned, is telecommunications. In January, we put out a report on 5G. It's about 50 pages in length. And really, that was the impetus for this presentation. I was speaking with Alyssa back in January, and she suggested that I come out and share with you what we learned. So that's what I'm going to do today. So in terms of today's presentation, I've broken 5G into 7 different aspects that I think properly frame out how to think about it at this early juncture. The first one is the key attributes. Secondly, we're going to talk about use cases, then technology, spectrum, the timing, network topology, and risks. And then at the end, what I'm going to do is I'll conclude by summarizing the key takeaways from my presentation. So let's start out with the key attributes. So there are 3 key attributes to 5G, which is based on the IMT 2020 vision. The first one's enhanced mobile broadband. And what 5G promises is 100 megabits per second of real-life experience in dense urban areas. It's also promising peak data rates of 10 gigabits per second, and the intention to support 10 megabits per second per square meter, which, to put that in perspective, is about 1,000 times greater in terms of capacity versus what you get today with LTE. The second thing is massive machine-type communications, or what I think of as broadly as how enabling the IoT world. The key is how to support billions of devices that are connecting to the network. And this is different than M2M. M2M has been around for a long time, but when you think of the sheer volume of devices that we're talking about in an IoT world, the current networks today aren't able to support that. And that's the big difference. Also, these devices are going to be low cost and low complexity, and they're going to have much stronger battery life than what we have today. And then the last one is ultra reliable and low latency, or what I'll refer to as UR or LL. This is for mission critical functions that have to work. If you think about healthcare, there's a lot of talk about things like remote surgery. If you think about emergency situations when people's lives depend on this, this stuff cannot go down. And making the network, that robust and hardened is something that needs to be factored in. I'd also point out that LTE today is about 80 to 100 milliseconds in latency, whereas 5G is expected to be sub 10 milliseconds. In fact, some people would tell you sub 1 millisecond. And that's what's going to enable the connected car to stop on a dime, opposed to stopping 20 feet from when it was told to. I'd also point out, just to put this into context, that this is faster than what it takes to blink your eye. And it's also, 9.7 milliseconds is below the realm of human perception. So this is going to be an instantaneous network, which is pretty impressive. I'd also point out that 5G is the first potential wireline replacement service. There's been a lot of debate that at some point the wireless networks could be as fast as wireline. 5G arguably could be that, and we'll talk about that a little bit further on. I'd also point out that while EMB is about speed, which will benefit the broadband experience on our phones, the UR and LL benefits or attributes, we're going to create use cases that go well beyond the phone. And if you saw the title of my presentation, Beyond the Phone, this is really what 5G is all about. Yes, your phone experience will be better, but this is going to go so much further. So, as I mentioned, 5G will take us beyond the phone. So let's talk about our first use case, and the first use case is going to be fixed wireless. Fixed wireless is the first 5G use case that will likely come to market. There's a lot of debate in the market about whether this will be successful. Companies like Vodafone, for example, have made public comments by their management that they're skeptical that it's actually going to work. And there's others out there as well that are skeptical, such as Google. Carriers, however, have argued that the technology has improved as a result of things like beamforming and massive MIMO. It's currently being trialed by Verizon and to a smaller degree AT&T. And what I think about is that if you think about Verizon, who's led with network technology, the fact that they're so focused on this, the fact that they're making such a big deal out of this, while I'm by no means a technology guy in terms of understanding the nitty-gritty, we've taken the view that this will be successful. The fact that Verizon is making such a big effort and putting real money into this, we at this point are believers. There's two reasons, however, that fixed wireless will be the first 5G product to come to market. First off, Verizon and AT&T need to have a new growth opportunity. If you think about phones and you think about wireless, for plus 20 years now, that's been a great growth opportunity, but that's changed. Number one is that everybody who wants a smartphone at this point has one. And secondly is that competition. T-Mobile and Sprint, as we all can appreciate, are much greater competitors to Verizon and AT&T today than they ever have been before. And that's limiting the growth that AT&T and Verizon now are seeing on their wireless side. So they have to go somewhere else. They have to do something to find growth somewhere else. I'd also point out that the way in which Verizon and AT&T are going about this is different. Verizon is pursuing a strategy which we refer to as thinking about new verticals, and AT&T is pursuing an integrated solution strategy. The thing with AT&T is by acquiring DirecTV and now acquiring Time Warner, they're going to create a video strategy that goes across devices, whether it's your phone, your tablet, your TV. The subscription will no longer be tied to your home. It'll be tied to you, the individual, and go with you wherever you want. That's a strategy that they're looking to execute on right now. Verizon, as we all can appreciate, doesn't have that. They're focusing on going into more verticals. You could look at the acquisitions they've done in telematics and fleet management. You could look at the acquisitions they're doing with Yahoo and AOL. You could look at the acquisitions that they're doing in connecting the city. They're more in need, in our view, of fixed wireless than AT&T, and that's arguably why you're seeing them pursuing it in such a more aggressive manner in terms of the 11 trial markets that they're doing right now versus what you hear out of AT&T. The other thing I'd point out as it relates to fixed wireless, though, is that there's also a clearly defined business model, and that's very important. How are the carriers going to actually make money on 5G? Fixed wireless is pretty simple. They're actually going to be going and competing against what today is our wireline networks at our home, whether it's cable or potentially whomever that ILEC is in that marketplace. There's a clear need for that service, and there's a clear model in terms of how they're going to make money providing fixed wireless, and that's why that's the first service you're seeing being brought to market in terms of 5G. We expect to see limited commercial deployments as early as 2018. So let's talk about the other use cases, which are mobile and probably a little bit more fun to talk about. So 3GPP has identified 74 use cases for 5G that leverage the three key attributes that we talked about: EMB, MMTC, UR, and LL. And as you see in our slides, we listed the 5 top areas that I think are being talked about in the marketplace: augmented reality, virtual reality, 4K video, self-driving cars, various healthcare initiatives, and then the industrial IoT, which will rely very heavily on big data. The most difficult part, though, is identifying the business models I already discussed, or said differently, how those building the networks will make money and ultimately the proper return on the investments to which they're making. If you think about 2G, 2G gave us email. If you think about 3G, 3G gave us the internet. And if you think about 4G, 4G gave us apps. They gave us video-oriented apps, ride-sharing apps, delivery services, dating apps. These are all ways in which not just those providing those apps, but even the carriers were able to make money because it forced you to go and get that new phone and to increase your data plan. You have to ask yourself, well, what's 5G going to do for the carriers? So what I can tell you at this point is it's going to be game-changing. I could also tell you it's going to be disruptive, or what we'd refer to as creative destruction. And broadly speaking, we think that what's going to predominantly get displaced because of 5G is inefficiencies. And you can think about that in a variety of different ways. However, it's going to be less about the phone experience. This is, again, not about necessarily improving your phone, which will improve, but this is about creating new business opportunities that are going to leverage a wireless network. To accelerate adoption, we think the carriers will need to move further up the value stack. As I already discussed with you, Verizon has made acquisitions that are specific to a certain vertical. They're moving up the application layer towards layer 7 in terms of offering not just being a dumb pipe, but an actual solution that's catered specifically to that industry or that vertical. And it's also going to creating industry-specific solutions that allow it not to be the dumb pipe. We think 5G will bring also the original vision of big data to fruition. If you could think about having sensors across our environments, whether it's inside or outside, across cities, the amount of data to which those sensors are going to be picking up is really what's going to basically be able to filter it into those big data solutions, which are going to make things like augmented reality a reality, right? The information that can be provided to you because of all that information collection. An interesting thought I'd also point out, though, is that in our view, 5G is also about solving first world country problems, and it's going to be less relevant to third world countries as much as it was for 4G. So what do I mean by that? If you think about third world countries, they've benefited extremely from putting up macro towers and providing a 3G and what will ultimately be a 4G experience, particularly for those markets that didn't have copper lines built into the ground. When you think about 5G, though, 5G, as I mentioned to you, is not necessarily about improving the phone experience. It's about making things like augmented reality and 4K video and self-driving cars a reality. I'd ask you, what's the value proposition in those third world countries versus it might be in the United States or other first world markets. So what's the takeaway here? The takeaway is that 5G will enable new business models that leverage a wireless network. So let's talk about technology. So the 5G network will be software-based and leverage both SDN and NFV technology. Depending on the use case, the processing will be done on the edge, or what's referred to as mobile edge computing, or MEC, or via the unlimited processing in the cloud. I'd actually argue to you that 5G is going to be the first G that's being built with the cloud in mind. How do you actually leverage off of that cloud, opposed to the cloud being an afterthought that was ultimately created in part because of 4G. I'd also point out that engagement with the network will be application specific. That would be referred to in some cases as network slicing, including what spectrum do you actually use for what that application or use case is. What bandwidth? Does it have to be a very high bandwidth solution, or can it actually be something that doesn't necessarily need that? And what various technological techniques are being used to connect that actual application? Ultimately, the 5G network is going to be a living, breathing, dynamic network. There's also going to be a new air interface, currently referred to as NR or new radio, which I'll discuss a little bit later on. But the goal here is to enable new use cases, but also to reduce the cost to deliver the gig. If you can imagine all these different services that we're contemplating, that's going to be a lot more bandwidth than what we have in the marketplace today, and we have to reduce the cost of delivering that gig. There was a study by a company called Mobile Experts recently, and what they said is that LTE macro, the cost to deliver a gig is $2.13. They said to deliver LTE using small cell, it costs $1.28 per gig. However, using 5G with millimeter wave spectrum, it's anticipated to cost 24 cents. So depending on if that's a small cell, that's a factor of 5 times lower, and if you're talking about an LTE macro, that's 10 times cheaper, which is pretty interesting. So the takeaway here then would be that 5G will utilize an intelligent and flexible network that's application-centric. So let's talk about spectrum. So in July, the FCC issued its Spectrum Frontiers rules that essentially open up the use of millimeter wave spectrum for 5G. There's 11 gigahertz in total that was part of the Spectrum Frontiers. 4 gigahertz is licensed. That's in the 28, 37, and 39 gigahertz bands. And 7 gigahertz, which is unlicensed, which is in the 64 to 71 gigahertz bands. They're also looking at opening up another 18 gigahertz of millimeter wave spectrum across 8 bands. So as we noted when we discussed fixed wireless, there's real debate on Wall Street about whether millimeter wave spectrum will work. We've all heard about millimeter wave spectrum for a very long time, and now we're seeing trials and clearly a move towards that, but there's a lot of people who are still very skeptical about it. I point out, though, that the focus on millimeter wave and how that ties into 5G helps explain Verizon's purchase of XO, which had 28 gigahertz spectrum that came with that. That was a bit of a surprise. People thought that XO would always be sold for its wireline infrastructure, but I'd argue to you that the primary reason they bought XO was for the spectrum. And also AT&T's recent purchase of a company called Fiber Tower, which has 39 gigahertz spectrum, and obviously the potential fight, which is happening right now for Straight Path, which also has 39 gigahertz spectrum. I point out to you, though, that the valuation is very different when you think of millimeter wave spectrum versus the low and mid-band spectrum. Just to put that in perspective, in the 600 megahertz auction that just completed, spectrum went for 93 cents per megahertz pop versus straight path, which when you look at the value being proposed by AT&T, that's less than 1 cent. It's about a half a cent per megahertz pop. It's a very different animal in terms of that spectrum, in terms of how it's going to be used and how much you actually need to make something of that. I'd also point out that just thinking about megahertz pops for a moment, there's other companies in the marketplace such as Dish which are actually being valued purely on megahertz pops. So this matters a lot when people are trying to figure out exactly what these companies are actually going to be worth or are worth. So the takeaway here, 5G will initially leverage millimeter wave spectrum, but over time we think it will leverage all bands. Right now all the focus is on millimeter, but I think ultimately you're going to see sub-6 gigahertz spectrum being used for 5G as well, particularly for EMB use cases. AT&T, as an example, has actually talked about using sub-6 gigahertz spectrum as well for 5G. So let's talk about the timing. So the best way to think about the timing is to look at the standards process. As a quick background, a group called 3GPP, and that includes about 400 companies and organizations across the world, they set the standard. Once they do so, they submit that to the ITU, or the International Telecommunications Union, which I learned through this process is actually part of the United Nations, which I thought was kind of interesting. In September of 2015, the ITU set the vision for 5G with the creation of the IMT 2020 vision, which I referenced earlier. So 3GPP issues new standards through releases. Release 15 will be the first 5G standard, but it will encompass LTE as well. In fact, some people would tell you that it's not a 5G standard, it's really Release 16. That will be the first one, but I would argue too it's Release 15. It's expected to come out in June of 2018, and it's going to focus on fixed wireless, because again, that's the first use case. That's what we need to get standardized first, although arguably what AT&T and Verizon right now in terms of their trials are pre-standard. And it's going to focus on EMB, or effectively how do you make things faster. It's also going to provide standards for the new radio, or NR. But you may have also heard that certain aspects of Release 15 were recently accelerated. This is somewhat complex, certainly for a guy who's more financial services oriented than technology oriented, but to summarize it, certain aspects of EMB that can work on current LTE equipment are going to be pushed forward or pulled forward, as known as what's known as NSA, or non-standalone new radios. Effectively, certain aspects of 5G are going to work with the current LTE equipment that's out there, and that way you could actually accelerate bringing that to market. So that's going to be released separately in December of 2017. That means that the mobile EMB could be in the market as early as 2019 or maybe late 2018 versus previously 2020. So essentially we're going to see the EMB benefit before the IoT or the low latency benefits. I'd also point out that Release 16 will be the first true 5G release that will rely on the new NR interface, or new radio interface, and there will be a 5G specific core. So really Release 16, which is expected in 2020, is truly when you see 5G kind of come to the market. So thus 5G will roll out in stages, but true 5G mobile offerings in the market are still a few years away. Lastly, I want to talk about the future of LTE. LTE by no means is dead. The way we think about it is as a G, or generational technology, lasts for about 20 years. 4G came out arguably in 2010. LTE is going to be around for 20 years, which will take you into 2030 time period, roughly speaking. When we think about 5G, we think about it as roughly coming out in 2020. It's going to be with us for at least, we think, 20 years, and therefore take us through 2040. I'd also point out, though, that when you think about the phone experience, LTE and LTE Advanced and everything that's going to come going forward, there's still a lot of reasons to have LTE out there, specifically for the phone experience. Again, in our view, 5G is really about going beyond the phone and making business cases that go that rely on a wireless network. So let's talk about the network topology, and I appreciate that this is a NEDAS conference, so you guys to some degree obviously are familiar with this. But to support the new attributes of 5G, we're going to need a new network topology. I think this is probably one of the most exciting parts of 5G. Networks thus far have been largely macro site centric. To put this in perspective, the 4 wireless carriers in the US each have around 50,000 macro sites. Verizon 2 days ago actually said that they have about 60,000. Lowell McAdam, the CEO, was on CNBC and he made the comment that they have about 60,000, but roughly 50,000 is a good way to think about it. 5G will rely heavily on small cells, however, and dependent on the forecast, we're going to need hundreds of thousands and likely at some point millions of nodes or small cells. Verizon said also on Tuesday that it wants to put 8,000 to 10,000 small cells in each of its markets. Assuming that they do that in the top 50 markets, that's 500,000 small cells for one carrier. Again, they have roughly 60,000 today. And in terms of small cells, they have 13,000 today. So there's a huge build out for small cells that's going to be coming over the next few years. The problem, however, is cost. If you think about a macro tower costs, let's just call it on average around $2,500 per month if it's actually a third-party tower, which Verizon is leasing space on. If we're going to go to a magnitude of 10, so I'm talking about going from 50 or 60,000 to 500,000, there is no way that they could pay $2,500 per small cell and make the math work. So we have to get the cost down significantly. That's probably one of the biggest issues that's facing 5G right now. So if the operators will have to support hundreds of thousands of small cells, they can't cost the same as a macro tower. So, but the difference though is that unlike macro towers, the cost structure is not a piece of steel that goes into the ground. If you think about a macro tower, cost $300,000. There's 4 customer opportunities that they have: AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, Sprint. There's not a lot of other people that need a macro tower, a lot of other businesses. Clearly there are some various emergency 911 and various radios, but for the most part it's a pretty limited market opportunity. The difference though with small cell is that the primary ingredient here is fiber. It's not a piece of steel that's going up on a pole or to some magnitude. In fact, 80% of the cost of a small cell or more are actually the fiber opposed to the actual equipment that sits on the small cell itself. The good news about fiber though is that fiber has a lot of use cases that go well beyond wireless. Healthcare companies need fiber. Cloud companies need fiber. Financial services companies need fiber. Everybody needs fiber. So the good point here is that they could sweat the asset a lot better. So rather than have 4 specific customer opportunities in the form of a steel 300,000 macro tower, with fiber, and when you're putting in a network, for example, in Verizon, you're going to create a small cell network that has many, many more fibers than what ultimately Verizon needs. And then you're going to take those fibers and you're going to sell them to all those other various companies. That's what's going to allow them to get that cost down to something we think as low as $200 per node. And we think that this is also helping drive demand for fiber today. Carriers are starting to build out small cells in anticipation of 5G. What's interesting is that they're actually using LTE equipment. They're building the small cells, they're putting LTE equipment into the boxes, but the reason that they're doing that is that they could find a way to argue that the incremental cost of building these small cells today versus utilizing more macro towers is roughly the same. They're doing more with small cells today when the costs are fairly similar. And the reason is they're prepping the network for 5G. If you could have the fiber already in place, if you could actually have the physical space where that small cell equipment is going to go, whether it's a lamppost or something else, when 5G actually does come to fruition, it's going to be a very quick swap out. And you put the 5G equipment in, and they'll be ready to go from much faster than they otherwise would if they were just waiting to when the 5G is actually here. It's also evident in the M&A that we're seeing in the market, including deals by Crown Castle, including the most recent deal that they did for Wilcom. What they're doing is they're effectively repurposing those assets. They're taking what are fiber-based assets, which I'd argue have been much less used for small cells, and they're redirecting the primary focus towards small cells on a go-forward basis. What's interesting, though, for Crown Castle, just in case you're curious, is that Crown Castle publicly continues to focus just on saying that this fiber is going to be used for small cells. In our view, the reality is they're going to use that fiber to go after those healthcare and cloud and financial service and other opportunities and other customers that want fiber. The reason they don't talk about that more publicly, though, is that it would be dilutive to their valuation. If you look at someone like a Zayo, who's arguably a pure play fiber company, they trade at about half the multiple that Crown Castle does. If investors started to perceive Crown Castle as more of a fiber company, or at least a portion of their business as being fiber oriented versus generically wireless focused, It's very arguable that people would do what's referred to as a sum of parts valuation. They'd apply a specific value for the fiber piece, which would be low, and they'd provide a specific value for the wireless piece, which would be high, but the blend would be something much lower than what they're getting today as a pure-play wireless company. That all said, we still think that fundamentally you're going to continue to see Crown Castle, maybe behind closed doors, maybe they don't talk about it as much, continue to be moved more into being what we'd refer to as just a simple fiber company. I'd also point out that when you look at companies like Extenet, which was acquired a few years ago by a company called Digital Bridge, Extenet had a great small cell network. The problem was they didn't have a lot of fiber. And at least in our view, the issue that Digital Bridge has suffered from since then is recognizing that for them to grow that business the way that I think that they have anticipated, they need a lot more fiber. But with fiber valuations being pushed up by companies like Crown Castle, which is paying 20 times EBITDA, it's made it very difficult for someone like a Digital Bridge, which doesn't have that REIT status, which arguably doesn't have as low a cost of capital, to make the same types of investments, and in our view, they've struggled in that regard. And it's also evident in yesterday's news that Verizon has agreed to purchase 12.4 million miles of fiber from Corning over the next 3 years. So the key takeaway is that 5G will require a different type of wireless network topology. So let's talk about the risks as I start to conclude. So first off, as it relates to the risks, the first one I'd argue is standards. The good news is I think 3GPP is doing a good job with that, so I don't perceive that being an issue right now, but that's something that has to continue to move forward. Secondly would be spectrum policy. The FCC has done a good job thus far with its spectrum frontiers, although clearly more spectrum, particularly in the millimeter wave bands, are going to have to be made available. And at some point, we do think you're going to see spectrum in the sub-6 gigahertz bands made available for 5G also. We also then are going to have to see focus on the infrastructure, and said differently, we need to get the cost down. That's going to be a very critical component to enabling this world. Companies like T-Mobile, for example, at this point I think are very skeptical about the cost of bringing 5G to fruition. After that, we're going to have to start to focus on the ecosystem development. What are the clear business cases so that people can actually make money off of these very significant investments to which they're making? And then ultimately, we got to make sure that the market demand is going to be there, which is somewhat related to the ecosystem development. And then lastly is security. I'm by no means a security analyst. I don't focus on that space very much, but just in our conversations with people around 5G and what we read, I think security is going to be the biggest issue here. If you have a car or any type of mission critical solution that's out there, and that's hacked or that's put in jeopardy, that's going to have significant consequences, much more so than what we've seen thus far. So at least in our view, security represents the biggest threat to achieving the vision of 5G. So just to summarize, so first off, we think 5G will take us beyond the phone. Everything I've hopefully said today would suggest that. This is about creating new business models that leverage a wireless network. 5G will enable new business models that leverage a wireless network. There you go. 5G will utilize an intelligent and flexible network that's application-centric. I think that that's going to be really interesting in terms of the technology that actually goes in, and some of the things like SDN and NFV, which we've talked about now for a few years, I think with 5G actually gets brought to fruition. 5G will initially leverage millimeter wave spectrum, but over time it will leverage all bands. That's evident right now in some of the stuff that's going on in the current market, such as the bidding for STRP or Straight Path. A true 5G mobile experience is a 2020 plus event. Probably one of the biggest, I guess, surprises I would have thought when we did this analysis late last year, which ultimately got published in January of this year, is that for all the talk there is about 5G, in fact, your keynote right now is on 5G. 5G is still many years away, but it is going to come out in stages. You're going to see fixed wireless. You're going to see branding around 5G arguably as early as maybe this year, but probably next year. But the true 5G mobile experience is still arguably 3 or 4 years away. 5G will overlap and run in unison with LTE through 2030, if not longer. Again, we think LTE stays around for a long time, particularly as it relates to how people utilize their phones. 5G will require a different type of wireless network topology, at least from the companies that I cover. This is proving a huge investment opportunity. And then lastly, security represents the biggest threat to achieving the vision of 5G. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Thank you. Gentleman over there.
You were talking about how AT&T, Verizon, and others are going to be moving up stack Amazon, how do you see the competition from Amazon, Microsoft, or others moving down stack?
So what's interesting is that the competitive playing field, when you think of the consumer, is going to be the flattest it's ever been before. So you have companies like Amazon and Google and Netflix and so forth that are going to be providing OTT type video solutions. But at the same time, you're seeing that, so I think about from cable perspective. So if you're cable, you're in a real difficult position going forward. On one side, you have fixed wireless. So you have AT&T and Verizon in theory and startups like Starry, which is operating in Boston, which are going to come for your broadband business. But then on the other side, you have these OTT players, which are going to come for your video business. That's a really difficult spot. So what we actually argue is that you're going to start to see the large carriers create vertical stacks of services. AT&T at this point is the best example of that. They have wireless. They have now video distribution. They're going to have content. They're going to create a vertical stack of services. And ultimately, I think that we'll refer to generically as a bundle, but really more of an integrated solution is how they're going to try to compete. And I think if you think of that, then I think that cable and companies like Comcast and Charter, it's just a matter of time before they also have to have a wireless strategy. Based on that competition, I think they're going to see from fixed wireless and from an OTT perspective. So our view, and we've wrote a report on this as well, is that by 2020, we think you have 3 or 4 conglomerate telco companies that offer that full stack. AT&T is already going to be there. We think Verizon will be there, which we'd actually argue implies that they're going to have to buy perhaps somebody like a Dish, although we appreciate that Dish is looking for a price point that's higher than what Verizon's at least at this point willing to pay. And I think that Comcast and or Charter somehow merge with T-Mobile and Sprint. Now maybe it's T-Mobile and Sprint that first come together and then that combined company is put out to the marketplace. Or it's that transaction never comes to be and you ultimately see T-Mobile go with one guy and Sprint go with the other. But I think ultimately if you look at 2020, while the underlying technology in terms of how they deliver a service might be different, the product set in terms of services are going to be very similar across those companies. Hopefully that answered your question. Any other questions? Gentleman over there.
You talk about the network slicing in the design, in your diagram there, of how different applications and services are not going to be unitary like it is today with LTE. It's a standard broadcast, a standard use, et cetera. How is that? Can you just expand on that a little?
Sure. So if you think about the latency that would be required for the connected car, right, stopping on a dime, versus potentially the latency for some type of industrial IoT solution, they don't both need that same level of latency. If you think about 4K video and the sheer speed or megabits are going to have to be provided to enable that service, again, going back to IoT and what might be required from a megabits perspective to enable that solution, because it's really not about the speed to connect IoT, but how do you support billions of devices, the magnitude of devices. The network's going to recognize that, and the network's going to know that they only need that much speed, so don't give them more than that because it's a waste. You know, don't give them that latency because it's a waste. And I think that the network's going to be dynamic in recognizing what to allocate to others based on their properties and what they need.
One of the network topology questions that, or topics that you talked about was having a lot more small cells. And one of the issues that we've seen, obviously for 4G, thank you, on the small cell deployments that we've seen over the last several years, we've had a major problem, and that's coming from primarily the cities and the metropolitan areas in getting access to all of those particular sites. So given what you talked about with Verizon and having 8,000 cells per city, there has to be a change in how the city's viewing these assets, right, for any of this to work. So how do you expect that the metropolitan cities and other areas are going to change their tune as to how they want to make money on these assets? Otherwise, we're kind of stuck where we are today.
Well, it's a bit of the wild, wild west right now. So anecdotally, I was speaking with a small cell provider who operates on the West Coast, and he was saying, and they're doing a deal for Verizon right now, and he was saying that in the city of San Diego, they're charging them 3 times what they're charging in the city of LA. There's no rhyme or reason. It's just that the city of San Diego has a better understanding of what's being done, and they know they can get it. Whereas LA was ignorant and basically, provided what is an amazing price in terms of, at least from the small cell provider's perspective. So it's very up and down, and there's all sorts of anecdotal examples like that. The good news right now is the FCC is taking that up, I think actually this week. First off, they're going to put a shot clock that sounds like on small cells. I think it's 90 days, very similar to what was done with macro towers a few years ago. And then secondly is they're arguing for more transparency. So for example, if somebody in a particular market is paying X for small cells or for space on a lamppost, that has to be publicly disclosed so that the next company that comes in there, has a much more transparency around, what the current market rate is. So that I think that those two things are going to be helpful. I think that that's mobility, by the way, who's pushing that initiative. Also I think WIA, or the Wireless Infrastructure Association, which was referred to as PCIA, I think is also starting to focus a lot more on small cells. And I think it's really going to be more regulation that pushes them to change. Any other questions?
So the way that we get our data seems to be consolidating as well, where you used to be able to get information through your carrier on your phone, and then you would get Wi-Fi at home through Comcast or any traditional cable provider. With there being risk to net neutrality, are some of the players in this market seeing the additional revenue from being able to charge that side of the house to help pay for the delivery of 5G to customers?
So I think I've seen statistics that roughly 2/3 of phone use is actually on a Wi-Fi network, 1/3 is actually on a mobile network. So you're right, a lot of that is being done by the actual wireline providers, if you will. As it relates to net neutrality, the biggest issue I see is peering, which when you think of the issues that Netflix raised a few years ago, there's that congestion in the pipe between when Netflix exchanges its traffic and maybe it's riding on someone like a Cogent as an example, with that last mile provider. I do think that that's a risk. I do think that we can get to a point where those guys start to effectively be bigger gatekeepers than they are today in terms of charging a bounty to someone like a Cogent to coming into their pipes. We're not seeing that now. And I think that some of the net neutrality initiatives, obviously under the previous FCC, put, I think, a safe environment in place, at least for this year, maybe next year. But I think if AT&T and Verizon and all the local last mile providers like a Comcast or a Charter, if their businesses start to get hurt, they're going to lash out. They're going to try to impede the success that others are having. So to some degree, and I always think this is kind of interesting, is that you have to see Comcast and Charter and AT&T and Verizon be successful. Like we can't continue to bleed them out and take their business from all these other areas when they're spending $20+ billion in CapEx a year and expect them to continue to do that. So you have to have them be successful. My hope would be that they are successful for their vertically aligned strategies, and that's good enough, and they don't get aggressive in other areas such as on peering to make money. But ultimately, if they are not succeeding in their more public areas in terms of focus, I think things like that will start to happen. Yeah, I think you're going to see it kind of bleed out. So you're going to see it in first dense urban areas or big cities. But I think ultimately then you'll see it start to follow down various highways and corridors. And then ultimately over time it'll get into more suburban areas. Just effectively like how it's happened with other generational technologies in terms of opportunity. But again, it goes back to the use case. So if there's a use case for a low latency, high speed, massive IoT solution that has some applicability in a suburban area, then you ultimately will see the small cells. But I think that when we think about augmented reality, virtual reality, when we think about the industrial IoT opportunity, the immediate thought I think for most of us is that has the most opportunity in those bigger areas. But I would think that over the course of time it'll bleed out. But to that point, if 4G is about the phone and ubiquitous coverage and having good speed on that device, and 5G is about enabling these other business solutions, I do think you're going to see that more spotty. at least to start before we actually start to see it across the entire United States.
Yeah, so I think this is along the same question. How do you see the dollars per square foot for rural America? It just seems like a macro site still makes more sense on a dollars per square foot in outside the cities.
Sure. No, I don't think the macro tower's dead at all. I just think that the growth opportunities been significantly hampered. So if you think about macro towers, they've historically grown around 6 to 8% on an organic basis. If you want to break that down, roughly 3% has come from escalators, minus 1% churn, which gets you net 2%. And then the remaining 6 to 8%, is that right? No, 4 to 6% comes from what we would refer to as cell splitting as well as amendment activity. Amendment activity is going to continue as we put that NR new radio equipment on the current macro towers. That's a new opportunity, maybe $500 a month per tower. However, the cell splitting situation is kind of dead, or at least it's going to have a significant drop off. And roughly 50% of that 4 to 6% has come from cell splitting versus amendment activity. And that's because we as a society, as a country, have enough macro towers out there at this point to cover most areas. That roughly 50 or 60,000 number is going to bleed up, but it's not going to go up on a hockey stick curve like you're going to see small cells. So macro towers on a go-forward basis, I think, are going to have lesser growth than what they have in previous generational upgrade cycles. With all that said, more specific to your question, we'll continue to put more macro towers in rural areas. In fact, when you look at what AT&T is going to do with FirstNet, part of the requirement is to put cell coverage into areas that don't have it today. So there will be new macro towers going up. I think that will be more from a phone experience perspective. But ultimately, I'm probably thinking 10 years from now, maybe you have small cells in some of those areas as well, and they very well could be on a macro tower just at a much lower height than what the macro signal's at. I'm being told to stop. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.